Blood didn't just stain the beige leather of seat 4A, it shattered the silence of Flight 902 forever. At 35,000 feet, there is nowhere to run. And for George Halloway, a man who thought his bank account placed him above the law, the realization came too late. He thought the young woman sitting across from him was nobody, just an obstacle he could remove with a fist. He was wrong. Minutes after the blow that left a young doctor bleeding out, the captain locked the cockpit. The air marshals stood up, and the entire flight was frozen in a terrified silence. But the real twist wasn't the violence. It was who the woman actually was, and the devastating phone call that was about to ruin Halloway's life before the plane even touched the ground. Setting John F., Kennedy International Airport, New York. The air inside the first-class lounge at JFK was thick with the scent of espresso and expensive cologne. But for George Halloway, it smelled like entitlement. George was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room. He annexed it, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars. He sat by the window, swirling a tumbler of scotch at 10 a.m., loudly berating his personal assistant over the phone. "I don't care what the SEC says. Fix it. Jonathan, I'm boarding in 20 minutes. If that merger isn't signed by the time I land in London, don't bother coming into the office on Monday." He hung up, slamming the phone onto the marble table. He was the CEO of Halloway Tech, a logistics giant. He was used to the world bending to his will. Today, however, the world was going to snap back. Sitting across the lounge, obscured by a large potted fern and a stack of medical journals, was Imani Brooks. Imani was 26, black, and possessed a quiet intensity that often made people uncomfortable. She wore a simple grey hoodie, leggings, and running shoes. To the untrained eye specifically, George's eye, she looked like a college student who had perhaps snuck into the lounge or was flying on a parent's miles. She was typing furiously on a laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. George caught the eye of a lounge attendant. "Hey, you, another scotch, and check my seat assignment. I want 1A. I always sit in 1A. The attendant, a polite woman named Sarah, who would also be working the flight, smiled tightly. "Mr. Halloway, seat 1A is currently occupied. You are in 1B. It's the same aisle access." "Sir." George's face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. "Occupied by whom I'm a Diamond Medallion member. I practically own this airline. It was booked months in advance, sir," Sarah said, placing a fresh drink down. "By a high-priority passenger." George scoffed, glancing around the room. His eyes landed on a distinguished-looking older white man in a military uniform near the buffet. That must be him, George thought. A general or something. Fine. He could respect rank. He drained his glass. He didn't notice Imani packing up her laptop. He didn't notice the embroidered logo on her backpack, Johns Hopkins Department of Neurosurgery. As the boarding call for first class came over the speakers, George pushed past the line, flashing his digital boarding pass. He marched down the jet bridge, ready to settle into his throne. He entered the cabin, turned left, and stopped dead. Seat 1A was not occupied by the general. It was occupied by the girl in the hoodie. Imani Brooks was already seated, her headphones on, reading a thick file marked "Confidential." George stared. The veins in his neck began to pulse. It was a visceral reaction, one born of years of unchecked bias and arrogance. In his world, girls who looked like Imani cleaned the offices. They didn't sit in the seats reserved for the masters of the universe. "Excuse me," George barked, not waiting for her to acknowledge him. He tapped her shoulder hard. Imani flinched, pulling down her headphones. She looked up, her eyes wide. "Yes." "You're in my seat," George lied, his voice loud enough that the passengers settling into business class behind them could hear. Imani checked her ticket. "No, I'm in 1A. See," she held up the stub. "Listen, sweetheart." George leaned in, his expensive Scotch breath hitting her face. "I don't know who you slept with to get that ticket, or if you're some rapper's girlfriend, but that seat is for business leaders, people who actually pay. I have work to do. Move to 1B. The cabin went quiet. Sarah, the flight attendant, rushed over. "Mr. Holloway, please take your assigned seat in 1B. Ms. Brooks is in her correct seat." "Ms. Brooks," George mocked the name. "This is a joke, right? Look at her. She looks like she's about to rob the place." Imani's expression shifted. The shock evaporated, replaced by a cold, steel resolve. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. She simply looked at him. "Sir, please take your seat," Imani said softly. "I need to review these notes before we land." "Notes? What notes?" "Your GED prep." George laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He sat in 1B, fuming. He spent the next 20 minutes as the plane taxied, muttering under his breath. Unbelievable. Woke airline policies. Letting anyone in. Imani ignored him. She had headphones on, but no music was playing. She heard every word. Setting 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, 2 hours into the flight. The lights were dimmed. Most passengers were asleep. The general, who George had assumed was the VIP, was snoring softly in 2A. George Holloway was not asleep. He was on his 4th scotch. The alcohol was mixing with his rage, creating a volatile chemical reaction. He had been trying to work, but the Wi-Fi was spotty. He blamed the plane. He blamed the airline. But mostly, he blamed the woman sitting 3 feet away from him. Every time he looked over, she was calm, serene. She had declined the champagne and asked for water. She was eating pretzels instead of the caviar meal. To George, this was proof she didn't belong. It was an insult to his status that he had to share this exclusive air with someone he deemed common. He stood up to use the lavatory, intentionally bumping into Imani's shoulder as he passed. "Oops," he sneered. Imani didn't look up from her papers. When he returned, he saw her bag was slightly protruding into the aisle. He kicked it. "Hard! Watch your stuff!" he snapped. Imani took a deep breath. She closed her folder and looked up at him. "Sir, I have asked you nicely. Please stop. You are intoxicated, and you are being aggressive." "Aggressive?" George's voice rose. "You think this is aggressive? You little affirmative action charity case. You have no idea who I am. I could buy your entire family and sell them for scrap." "Mr. Holloway." Sarah, the flight attendant, appeared from the galley, her face pale. "Lower your voice immediately, or I will have to cut you off." "You don't tell me what to do," George shouted, spinning on her. "I'm the victim here. I paid $12,000 for this flight, and I have to sit next to trash." That was the breaking point. Imani unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. She wasn't tall, perhaps 5'4", but she held herself with immense dignity. "My name is Dr. Brooks," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin like a scalpel. "And I am not trash. I am on this flight because I am leading a surgical team in London tomorrow morning. Now sit down and shut up." The humiliation was too much for George. To be dressed down by a young black woman in front of the entire cabin. his fragile ego fractured. "You lie." George screamed. He lunged. It happened so fast Sarah didn't have time to scream. George threw a backhand, his heavy gold signet ring catching Imani squarely across the cheekbone. The sound was sickening, a wet crack of metal on bone. Imani stumbled back, falling into seat 1A. She brought her hand to her face. When she pulled it away, her hand was coated in bright, crimson blood. It dripped from her nose and a gash on her cheek, splattering onto the pristine beige leather of the seat and her white medical files. The cabin gasped. George stood over her, breathing heavily, his fist clenched. "That'll teach you respect," he spat, for 3 seconds. There was absolute silence, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Imani looked at the blood on her hand. She was trembling, not from fear, but from shock. Then, the flight changed, setting the cabin, moments later. "Sit down now." The voice didn't come from Sarah. It came from seat 3B. A man in a hoodie, who had been sleeping the entire time, had launched himself over the seat. He didn't look like a flight attendant. He tackled George Holloway with the precision of a linebacker, slamming him into the bulkhead. "Federal Air Marshal, stay down." George shrieked as his arm was twisted behind his back. "Get off me. Do you know who I am?" "She attacked me." "Shut your mouth!" The marshal roared, zip-tying George's wrists so tight the plastic bit into the skin. Simultaneously, the general from seat 2. A was up. He wasn't just a passenger. He knelt beside Imani. "Ma'am, let me see. I'm a retired field medic." "I'm okay," Imani wheezed, though blood was pouring freely now, soaking the collar of her hoodie. I think my nose is broken." Sarah was on the interphone to the cockpit, her voice shaking. "Captain, we have a level 4 situation in first class. Passenger assault, severe injury. We have blood. Marshals have the suspect secured." The response from the cockpit was immediate. The seatbelt sign pinged on a double chime, then a triple chime. Ding, ding, ding. The captain's voice came over the PA system. It wasn't the soothing, cruise control voice pilots usually use. It was cold, hard, and terrifyingly serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Miller. Put your seatbelts on immediately. All flight attendants, take your stations. We are initiating an emergency lockdown of the cabin. No one is to stand up. If you stand up, you will be restrained. We are diverting." The plane banked sharply to the left. The engine pitch changed from a hum to a roar as they descended. George, pinned to the floor in the galley area by the marshal, was struggling. "You can't divert. I have a meeting. I'll sue you. I'll sue this whole airline." The marshal, a burly man named Officer Davis, leaned down. "Buddy, you just committed a federal felony assault on an international flight. The only meeting you're going to is with the FBI." But the real drama was happening in seat 1A. Imani was holding a towel to her face. The medic was checking her pupil dilation. "Dr. Brooks," Sarah said gently, handing her an ice pack. "I am so sorry." Imani shook her head, wincing. "It's not your fault. Sarah." She looked at the blood on her files. "But he might have just killed a patient." Sarah looked confused. "What?" Imani pointed to the blood-soaked file. "I'm not just a surgeon. I'm a transplant specialist. I'm flying to London to perform a heart transplant on a 6-year-old girl. The donor heart is waiting there. If I don't get there, she dies." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The word spread through the cabin like wildfire. The racist in 1B hadn't just punched a girl. He had potentially signed a death warrant for a child in London. The atmosphere in the plane shifted from fear to a collective, simmering rage. Every passenger was staring at George Halloway. If the marshal hadn't been there, the other passengers might have torn him apart. Captain Miller came back on the PA. "Folks, we are diverting to Gander, Newfoundland. We are landing in 20 minutes. Police are waiting on the tarmac. I want everyone to remain seated. And to the man in row 1, you better pray that young lady is all right." The plane descended through the clouds. The cabin was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was George's pathetic whimpering and the steady drip of Imani's blood onto the floor. But as the wheels touched down in Gander, George Halloway thought he could still buy his way out. He thought a good lawyer and a checkbook would fix a broken nose. He didn't know that Imani Brooks had made a phone call before they took off, and he didn't know who her father was. The twist was waiting at the bottom of the air stairs. Setting Gander International Airport, Newfoundland, tarmac and terminal. The descent into Gander was rough, the turbulence shaking the cabin as if the plane itself was trembling with rage. But inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was frozen in a terrifying stillness. George Halloway was no longer shouting. The adrenaline of his assault had faded, replaced by the throbbing pain of the zip ties cutting into his wrists and the cold realization that the aircraft wasn't moving toward London anymore. It was descending into a desolate, icy Canadian outpost. Captain Miller greased the landing, but he didn't taxi to a gate. He stopped the massive jet right in the middle of the tarmac. Through the windows, the passengers could see the flashing red and blue lights of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. There weren't just 1 or 2 cars, there was a fleet of them. An ambulance was already racing toward the plane, its siren wailing a lonely sound against the wind. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Miller's voice cracked over the intercom, stripped of all customer service warmth. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are now under the jurisdiction of the Canadian federal authorities. No one stands up until the officers have cleared the cabin." The front door blew open, letting in a blast of freezing, sub-zero air that swirled through the cabin, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. 2 RCMP officers, looking like giants in their heavy Kevlar vests and parkas, boarded the plane. They didn't smile. They didn't wave. They walked with the heavy, purposeful gait of men who had heard the details of the assault from the tower. "Where is he, the lead officer?" Sergeant Collins demanded. His voice was a low growl. Air Marshal Davis, who had been pinning George to the bulkhead for the last 30 minutes, pointed to the floor. George was curled up near the galley, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with the coffee that had spilled during the scuffle. "Get him up," Collins ordered. Davis hauled George to his feet. George, seeing the uniforms, tried to muster a shred of his former arrogance. He straightened his tie with his bound hands, a pathetic gesture. "Officers, thank God," George stammered, his eyes darting around. This woman. She was erratic. I was defending myself. I'm an American citizen. I demand to speak to the U.S. consulate immediately. I have rights. Sergeant Collins didn't blink. He stepped into George's personal space, looming over him. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it. You are under arrest for aggravated assault, causing bodily harm on an international flight. That's a federal offense in my country, and a felony in yours. You're making a mistake, George shrieked as Collins grabbed his arm with a grip like a vice. I'm George Halloway. Google me. I'm worth $200 million. I don't care if you're the King of England, Collins said, shoving him toward the open door. In Canada, you don't hit women. Move." As they dragged him down the aisle, a strange thing happened. There was no booing, no jeering, just a sea of smartphones. Every passenger in business class and economy plus had their phones raised, recording him. Hundreds of eyes tracked his walk of shame. It was a silent, digital judgment. George tried to hide his face, but it was too late. The lens of the internet never blinks. Behind him, the scene was much different. The paramedics rushed onto the plane, bypassing the empty seat where George had sat and crowding around 1A. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" a paramedic asked gently, shining a penlight into Imani's eyes. Imani was clutching a towel to her face. It was soaked through with bright red blood. Her left eye was swollen shut, turning a gruesome shade of purple and black. She looked small in the big leather seat, shivering from the shock and the cold air. I'm a doctor," Imani whispered, her voice thick. "I suspect a nasal fracture. Possible orbital floor fracture. No loss of consciousness. We need to get you to the hospital in Gander immediately for scans," the paramedic said, reaching for her arm to help her up. Imani jerked back. "No." The cabin went quiet again. "Ma'am, you've lost a lot of blood," the paramedic insisted. "You have a head injury." "I can't go to the hospital," Imani said, her voice rising with panic. She grabbed the bloody file on her lap. "I have to get to London. I have a patient, a 6-year-old girl. Her name is Sophie. She is in heart failure. I am the lead surgeon for her transplant. The heart is on ice. It has a shelf life of 4 hours once it arrives. If I am stuck in a hospital in Newfoundland, Sophie dies." She looked up at the paramedic, her one good eye pleading. "Do you understand I am the only one who can do the procedure? It's a complex, congenital defect. If I don't get on a plane right now, that man didn't just break my nose. He killed a child." The paramedic looked at Sergeant Collins. Collins looked at the captain. "The plane is a crime scene." "Doctor." "Brooks," Captain Miller said softly, his face pained. "We are grounded until the investigators process it. And the crew, we're timed out. We can't fly legally." Imani slumped back in her seat, a sob escaping her throat. The adrenaline was fading, and the despair was setting in. She had trained for 12 years for this surgery. She had promised Sophie's parents, and now, because of a racist in a suit who didn't like her hoodie, it was all over. "It's over," she whispered. "God, it's over." From seat 2, the older man, the one George had assumed was a general, stood up. He walked over to Imani. He didn't look at the blood. He looked at her resolve. "It's not over." "Doctor," he said. His voice commanded the room. He turned to Captain Miller. "Captain, I need to use your satellite phone in the cockpit. Now." Captain Miller blinked. "Sir, that's restricted for flight crew only." The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black leather wallet. He flipped it open. It wasn't a military ID. It was a diplomatic badge with a silver crest that very few people recognized. But those who did obeyed. "My name is Robert Dew Walker," the man said. "I am the Undersecretary of Defense for Logistics. I am authorizing a priority medical transport. Captain, get me that phone. Setting RCMP, holding cell Gander." The holding cell in Gander smelled of pine cleaner and stale coffee. It was a stark contrast to the first-class lounge George Halloway had started his day in. There was no leather furniture, only a metal bench bolted to the concrete floor. George paced the small cell like a caged tiger. He was still in his suit, but his tie had been taken. Along with his belt and shoelaces, Standard suicide prevention protocol. He looked ridiculous, his expensive slacks sagging around his waist, his socks sliding on the cold floor. He was furious. But more than that, he was confused. In his life, consequences were things that happened to other people, poor people. When George made a mess, he wrote a check, and the mess went away. The heavy steel door buzzed and clanked open. Sergeant Collins walked in, carrying a clipboard. He didn't sit down. He just leaned against the wall, watching George with a look of utter contempt. "I want my lawyer," George spat, "and I want my phone. I have a right to a phone call." "You do," Collins said calmly. "But first, you should know the situation has evolved." Evolved. What does that mean? Did the girl admit she provoked me? George sneered. She was in my space. She was aggressive. Collins looked at the clipboard. The victim, Dr. Imani Brooks, has been transported. She suffered a comminuted fracture of the nasal bridge and a zygomatic fracture. She's currently flying to London on a US military transport jet that was diverted from a refueling stop in Halifax, specifically for her. George froze. Military transport for a doctor. She's a very important woman. Mr. Holloway, Collins said. But that's not your biggest problem right now. Collins tossed a folder onto the metal table. It slid across and hit George's hand. Your problem is the internet. George opened the folder. It wasn't a legal document. It was a printout of a screenshot from Twitter X. The image was blurry, but unmistakable. It was George, face twisted in hate, standing over a bleeding Imani. The caption read, CEO of Holloway Tech assaults black female surgeon on Flight 902. Blood everywhere. He called her trash before breaking her face. The hashtag was hashtag Holloway Brutal. It has 4 million views, Collins said. And that was 20 minutes ago. It's trending #1 globally. CNN is running it on a loop. The BBC just picked it up. George felt his knees go weak. He sat down heavily on the metal bench. No, that's out of context. There's video. George, Collins said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. Audio 2. Everyone heard what you said. I could buy your family and sell them for scrap. That's a direct quote. Isn't it? George's hands started to shake. I need to call Jonathan, my fixer. He can scrub this. He knows people at Google. Here. Collins handed him a battered wireless phone. Make your call. I'll enjoy listening to this. George dialed with trembling fingers. He called Jonathan, his crisis manager in New York. Jonathan, thank God. Listen, it's a disaster. I need you to issue a statement. Say I was provoked. Say she attacked me first. And get the legal team to George. Jonathan's voice was hollow. Dead. Yes, it's me. Fix this. I can't fix this. Greg, what do you mean you can't fix it? That's what I pay you for. Greg, listen to me, Jonathan said, his voice cracking. I'm packing my desk. I just got fired. Fired by who? The board of directors. They held an emergency meeting 10 minutes ago, via Zoom. They voted unanimously to remove you as CEO, effective immediately. They're invoking the moral turpitude clause in your contract. You don't get a severance package. You don't get the stock options. You're out. George felt the room spin. They can't do that. I built that company. It gets worse, Jonathan whispered. Do you know who the girl is? She's nobody. She's some affirmative action hire at Hopkins. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Greg, Doctor, Imani Brooks is the only daughter of Judge William Brooks. George stopped breathing. Judge William Brooks wasn't just a judge. He was a federal court of appeals judge, known as the hangman, for his harsh sentencing on white-collar criminals. But more importantly, Judge Brooks sat on the board of the Logistics Regulatory Commission that controlled Halloway Tech's licenses. And Jonathan continued, his voice barely a whisper. Her mother is Catherine Halloway. George's brain short-circuited. What no? I don't know a Catherine Halloway. Not your relation, you idiot! Jonathan snapped, losing his patience. Catherine Halloway is the CEO of Ascend Medical, the company you were flying to London to sign the merger deal with. The woman sitting across from you, the woman you beat to a pulp, was the daughter of the woman you were going to sign a $10 billion contract with. The phone slipped from George's hand. It clattered onto the concrete floor. The merger was dead. His job was dead. His reputation was dead. Sergeant Collins picked up the phone. He looked at George, who was staring at the wall. Catatonic. Looks like you made a bad call. Mr. Halloway, Collins said dryly. Now, stand up. We have to take your mug shot. And trust me, this one is going to be on the front page of every paper in the world. Setting U.S. Air Force C-37 to Gulf Stream, high over the Atlantic, while George Halloway was watching his life incinerate in a Canadian jail cell. Dr. Imani Brooks was fighting a different battle at 45,000 feet. The C-37A was a military transport jet, usually reserved for generals and senators. It was faster than a commercial airliner, much faster. Imani sat in a leather swivel chair, an IV line running into her arm. A military medic was cleaning the cuts on her face. The pain was excruciating, a throbbing, blinding headache that pulsed with every heartbeat. Her left eye was completely swollen shut, and she could feel the jagged edge of the bone in her nose shifting every time she moved. Dr. Brooks, your blood pressure is spiking, the medic said, checking the monitor. I can give you morphine. But no morphine, Imani gritted out. I need a clear head. I have to operate in 3 hours. Ma'am, with all due respect, the medic said, you have a concussion. You shouldn't be operating a toaster, let alone performing a heart transplant. Imani turned her head, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. She looked at Robert Walker, the undersecretary who had arranged the flight. He was sitting opposite her, reviewing a tactical map on a tablet. Mr. Walker, Imani said. What is our ETA? We're pushing the engines to the red line. Doctor, Walker said without looking up. We'll be on the ground at Heathrow in 2 hours and 10 minutes. A helicopter is waiting on the tarmac to fly you directly to the hospital roof. You'll make the window. Barely. Imani closed her good eye. She thought about Sophie, the little girl with the blue eyes and the failing heart. She thought about George Halloway's fist coming toward her face. She felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford anger. Anger made your hands shake. Anger clouded your judgment. She needed to be ice. Do you know why he hit me? Imani asked softly. Walker looked up. His eyes were kind, but hard. Because he's a small man who thinks he's a big man, and he saw someone he thought was smaller than him. He called me trash, she whispered. He was wrong. Walker said, I saw your file. Doctor, graduated high school at 15, Johns Hopkins Med at 19, youngest attending surgeon in the history of the department. You aren't trash. You're a national asset. That's why you're on this plane. The satellite phone on the table buzzed. Walker picked it up. Walker here. Yes. I see. Understood. He hung up and looked at Imani. A grim smile touched his lips. If it makes you feel any better, Doctor, you should know what's happening on the ground. What the video of the assault has gone viral. Global. Holloway Tech stock has dropped 40% in the last hour. The board just fired him. And your mother? Walker paused. I just got off the phone with Catherine. She's at the hospital in London, waiting for you. She also just cancelled the merger. Holloway's company is effectively bankrupt. He's ruined. Imani didn't smile. She didn't feel joy. She just felt a heavy, weary sense of balance being restored. I don't care about his money, Imani said, touching the bandage on her nose. I care about Sophie. You'll save her, Walker said confidently. But there's one more thing. The British authorities are waiting for Holloway. We extradited the paperwork while we were in the air. Since the assault happened on a US carrier in international airspace, but the flight was destined for the UK, there's a jurisdictional loophole. We're pushing for him to be tried in the UK. Why? Because... Walker leaned forward. The UK has very strict laws about hate crimes, and the judge assigned to the preliminary hearing, he's a close personal friend of your father. Holloway isn't just going to jail. Imani, he's going to hell. The plane banked. Through the window, the clouds parted, and the grey, sprawling mass of London appeared below. We're beginning our descent, the pilot announced. Doctor, Brooks, get ready. Imani unbuckled her belt. She stood up, swaying slightly. The pain was there, but she locked it away in a box in her mind. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a surgeon. She grabbed her blood-stained medical bag. Let's go save a life, she said. Setting St. Thomas's Hospital, London, Operating Theatre 4, the Royal Air Force helicopter touched down on the roof of St. Thomas's Hospital with a deafening roar, the rotor wash whipping Imani's hair across her bruised face. She stumbled out, flanked by 2 military medics who had kept her upright during the short flight from Heathrow. She looked like a war victim. Her left eye was swollen shut, purple and angry. Her nose was splintered with tape, and dried blood was crusted on her cheek. But her good eye was focused like a laser. A team of nurses and doctors met her at the helipad doors. Doctor. Brooks, I'm Doctor. Patel, Chief of Cardiology, a tall man said, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. Good God, are you fit to operate? We heard about the assault, but... Look at you, I'm fine, Imani rasped, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to topple her. Is the patient prepped? Sophie is on bypass. Doctor, Patel said, jogging to keep up with her, as she strode toward the scrub room. The donor heart arrived 20 minutes ago. We've been cooling it, but the ischemic time is ticking. We have maybe 40 minutes before the tissue becomes non-viable. Imani pushed through the double doors. Then we don't have time to talk about my nose. Scrub in. In the scrub room. Imani stared at herself in the mirror. She looked terrifying, but she didn't see a victim. She saw a warrior. She washed her hands methodically, the ritual calming her racing heart. 10 minutes, she told herself. Just give me 4 hours of clarity. She entered the operating theatre. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the bypass machine. Sophie, a tiny 6-year-old girl, lay under the blue drapes, her chest cavity open. Scalpel, Imani said. Her voice was steady. For the next 5 hours, the drama of Flight 902 ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of surgery. Imani moved with a grace that defied her injuries. She ignored the throbbing in her head. She ignored the exhaustion. She was a virtuoso, and the scalpel was her bow. But 2 hours in, disaster struck. "Pressure is dropping," the anesthesiologist shouted. "She's throwing clots." Imani's vision blurred. The concussion was catching up to her. The room spun. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing hard. "Doctor?" Brooks, a nurse, asked, alarmed. "Are you okay?" Imani closed her eyes for a second. She saw George Holloway's sneering face. She heard him call her trash. "I am not trash," she thought. "I am a savior." She opened her eyes. The blurriness cleared. "Push heparin," Imani ordered, her voice cutting through the panic. "Get me the suction. I need to clear the field. We are not losing her today." She worked faster, her hands flying. She sutured the aorta with microscopic precision. She connected the pulmonary artery. "Clamp off," she whispered. The room held its breath. The new heart sat in Sophie's chest, still and lifeless. "Shocking, Doctor," Patel said. "Zap. Nothing. Again. 20 joules. Zap. Nothing." Imani reached into the chest cavity. She took the small, cold heart in her gloved hand. She closed her eyes and gently massaged it. "Come on, little one." She prayed. "Beat for me." Thump, a single beat against her palm. Thump, 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 thump. The monitor picked up the rhythm, a strong, steady sinus rhythm. "We have a heartbeat," the anesthesiologist announced, his voice thick with emotion. Imani stepped back, her hands shaking for the first time. She looked at the monitor, then at the little girl who would grow up to have a life because she didn't let a man stop her. "Close her up," Imani whispered. Then the adrenaline crashed, her knees buckled, and Dr. Brooks, the hero of Flight 902 and Operating Theatre 4, collapsed into Dr. Patel's arms, setting HMP, Wandsworth and the Old Bailey, London. The fall of George Holloway did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing descent that began in a holding cell in Gander and ended in the dank, Victorian misery of HMP Wandsworth in South London. For 6 weeks, George had existed in a state of suspended disbelief. He was a man who had spent the last decade in penthouses, private jets, and boardrooms where the temperature was always set to a perfect 72 degrees. Now, he lived in a 6 by 8 foot cell that smelled of damp concrete, unwashed bodies, and despair. His bespoke suits had been traded for a grey prison tracksuit that scratched his skin. His identity, CEO, millionaire, titan of industry, had been stripped away, replaced by a prisoner number, A9284CV. But even as he sat on the thin, lumpy mattress, staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling, George clung to a delusion. He believed, with the arrogance of a man who has never truly lost, that this was temporary. It was a misunderstanding, a clerical error. His lawyers would fix it. They always fixed it. He didn't realize that outside those prison walls, the world wasn't just moving on, it was gathering kindling for his pyre. The day of the trial broke grey and rainy, typical London weather that seemed to seep into the bones. As the prison transport van, a claustrophobic metal box known as a sweat box, rumbled through the streets toward the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, commonly known as the Old Bailey. George tried to steady his shaking hands. He expected a quiet hearing, maybe a few reporters. When the van turned the corner onto Newgate Street, the roar was audible through the reinforced steel walls. It sounded like a football stadium. "What is that?" George asked the guard sitting opposite him. The guard, a burly man who had spent 20 years escorting murderers and thieves, looked at George with a grim smile. "That, Mr. Holloway, is for you," You're quite the celebrity." When the doors opened and police escorted him into the courthouse, George caught a glimpse of the scene through a gap in the security perimeter. There were hundreds of people. They held signs: "Justice for Dr. Brooks," "End executive privilege," "Racism has no fly zone." The flashbulbs were a blinding staccato storm. For the first time, George didn't feel like a VIP. He felt like prey. Courtroom number 1 at the Old Bailey is steeped in history. It is a place of high drama, where the fate of London's most notorious criminals has been decided for centuries. The wood panelling is dark and imposing, the air thick with the weight of judgment. George was led into the dock, a glass-enclosed box raised above the court floor. It was designed to keep the accused separate from society, a fishbowl for the jury to examine. He smoothed his suit. His legal team had managed to bring him one, though it now hung loosely on his gaunt frame and looked out at the gallery. It was packed. Every seat was taken. Journalists from the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, and CNN were crammed into the press bench, their laptops open, and there, in the front row of the public gallery, sat the woman he had tried to destroy, Dr. Imani Brooks. She looked nothing like the battered victim he remembered from the plane. The swelling in her face had subsided, though a faint, silvery scar traced the line of her nose, a permanent reminder of his signet ring. She wore a tailored navy blazer and a white blouse. Her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She sat with a stillness that radiated power. Next to her was a small girl with a mass of curly hair, clutching a teddy bear. That must be the patient. George realized with a jolt of nausea. The heart transplant girl. The sight of the child alive, breathing, watching him with wide, innocent eyes, hit him harder than any fist. "All rise." The usher bellowed. Lord Justice Harrison swept into the room. He was a terrifying figure in his scarlet robes and white wig, a man known in legal circles as the Iron Gavel for his zero-tolerance policy toward violent crime. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked directly at George Holloway, his eyes cold and unblinking behind half-moon spectacles. The Crown prosecutor was a woman named Eleanor Hayes, a King's Counsel KC with a reputation for shredding defendants with surgical precision. She didn't shout. She didn't pace. She stood at her lectern, adjusting her robes, and spoke in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hayes began, "we often hear about air rage. We hear about unruly passengers. But what happened on Flight 902 was not rage. It was not a dispute over a seat recline. It was a calculated, brutal assault on a medical professional by a man who believed his bank account gave him the right to break another human being's face." She paused, letting the silence hang. "Mr. Holloway didn't just assault Dr. Brooks. He assaulted the sanctity of a life-saving mission. He delayed a heart transplant. He gambled with the life of a 6-year-old child because his ego was bruised." Hayes turned to the screen mounted on the wall. "I could call witnesses to describe the event. But in this modern age, the truth is often recorded. Please watch the screen." The courtroom dimmed. The video played. It was the viral footage recorded by the passenger in 3A. The audio was crystal clear. "You little affirmative action charity case. You have no idea who I am." George flinched in the dock. His own voice sounded shrill, hateful. "I could buy your entire family and sell them for scrap." A gasp rippled through the gallery. The jury, 12 ordinary Londoners, looked from the screen to George. Their expressions ranged from disgust to open hostility. Then, the sickening crack of the punch, the image of Imani falling back, blood spraying onto the beige leather. Hayes stopped the video on a freeze frame of George standing over Imani, his fist clenched, his face twisted in a rictus of hate. "The defense will tell you, mister. Holloway was stressed," Hayes said, turning back to the jury. "They will tell you he was intoxicated. They will tell you he felt threatened by a 5'4" woman reading medical files. But look at that face. That is not fear. That is domination. That is a man who thinks he is a god, punishing a mortal for daring to exist in his space." George's barrister, a high-priced litigator named Mr. Thorne, tried his best, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a paper umbrella. My client was under immense pressure regarding a multi-billion-dollar merger, Thorne argued weakly. He suffers from anxiety. The mixture of alcohol and altitude created a state of temporary cognitive dissonance. Judge Harrison interrupted him. "Mr. Thorne, are you suggesting that business stress is a legal defense for breaking a woman's nose? If that were the case, half the city of London would be brawling in the streets by lunchtime." Laughter rippled through the court. It was a dark, mocking sound. George sank lower in his seat. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. But the true climax came when the prosecution called their final witness regarding the character and impact portion of the trial. The Crown calls Mrs. Catherine Holloway Brooks. George's head snapped up. Catherine Holloway. The double doors opened, and a woman walked in who sucked the air out of the room. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal power suit, radiating the kind of wealth that doesn't need to shout. She was the CEO of Ascend Medical, one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in Europe. She was the woman George had spent 6 months trying to impress. He had sent her gifts. He had courted her board. He had practically begged for the merger that would have made him a billionaire. She walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. She didn't look at the jury. She turned her head and locked eyes with George. The look she gave him was not one of anger. It was one of absolute, crushing disappointment. It was the look a parent gives a child who has done something unforgivable. "Mrs. Holloway Brooks," Hayes asked, "you are the CEO of Ascend Medical, correct?" "I am." "And you were, until 6 weeks ago, in negotiations with the defendant's company, Holloway Tech." "We were in the final stages of a $12 billion merger," Catherine said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and deadly. "Mr. Holloway was flying to London to sign the papers. It would have been the deal of the decade. And what is the status of that deal now?" Catherine smiled. It was a cold, wintry smile. "The moment I saw the news footage of a man beating a woman on a plane, I ordered my legal team to shred the contracts. I do not do business with animals. And," Hayes paused, "can you tell the court if you have any personal connection to the victim, Dr. Imani Brooks?" The courtroom went silent. This was the moment. Catherine took a slow breath. "Doctor, Imani Brooks is my daughter." George felt the blood drain from his face. His hands gripped the edge of the glass dock so hard his knuckles turned white. His daughter, the woman he had punched, was the daughter of the woman who held his financial future in her hands. "She uses her father's surname professionally," Catherine continued, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage, "because she wanted to make it on her own merits. She didn't want to be Catherine Holloway's daughter. She wanted to be Dr. Brooks. She worked double shifts. She graduated top of her class. She is everything, mister. Halloway is not self-made, honorable, and kind. Catherine leaned forward, speaking directly to George across the courtroom. You told my daughter you could buy her family and sell them for scrap. Mr. Halloway, my family is worth more than your entire lineage. And you didn't just break a nose. You broke your own life. You are bankrupt. Your board has fired you. Your assets are frozen. And I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never lead a company again. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a man's soul being dismantled in public. The jury didn't even leave the room to deliberate. They huddled for 2 minutes, whispering furiously. The foreman, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, stood up. Have you reached a verdict? The clerk of the court asked. We have. On the count of grievous bodily harm with intent, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the count of endangering the safety of an aircraft? Guilty. On the count of racially aggravated assault? Guilty. Each word was a hammer blow. Guilty. 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 Judge Harrison didn't wait for a pre-sentencing report. He had heard enough. He shuffled his papers, took off his glasses, and looked at George with a mixture of pity and revulsion. George Halloway, the judge began, his voice booming through the chamber. You are a symptom of a sickness. You are a man who has lived a life of unchecked privilege, believing that your wealth insulated you from the consequences of your cruelty. You treated a commercial airliner as your private fiefdom and your fellow passengers as serfs. The judge leaned over the bench. You assaulted a woman who was racing against time to save a life. You mocked her. You racialized her. You physically battered her. And in doing so, you revealed the utter hollowness of your character. I have taken into consideration your lack of prior convictions, the judge continued, but I have also taken into consideration the severity of the attack, the racial motivation, and the potential loss of life regarding the patient in London. The arrogance you displayed is breathtaking. The sentence of this court is that you be imprisoned for a period of 8 years. George gasped. 8 years. He would be nearly 50 when he got out. Furthermore, the judge added, I am ordering you to pay restitution to Dr. Brooks in the amount of £5 million for physical and emotional damages, and, as a special condition of your release, you are hereby placed on the international no-fly list. You will never set foot on an airplane again. If you wish to travel, Mr. Halloway, you can take a boat, or perhaps you can walk. It will give you time to think. Take him down. The guards moved in. They didn't handle him gently. They grabbed George by the arms, hauling him up. No, George shouted, his voice cracking. I can pay double. Let me speak to Catherine. Please. He looked toward the gallery, desperate for a lifeline. But Catherine Halloway was already standing up, buttoning her coat. She didn't look at him. She turned to her daughter. Imani Brooks stood up. She looked at the man in the glass box, the man who had tried to make her feel small. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked at him with profound indifference. She reached down and took the hand of the little girl. Sophie. Come on. Sophie, Imani said, her voice clear and strong. Let's go get some ice cream. Okay, doctor. Imani, the little girl chirped. They turned their backs on George Halloway as the guards dragged him toward the door that led down to the cells. George watched them walk out of the courtroom, The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing him in with his fate. The last thing he saw was the flash of cameras from the hallway, capturing the image of the doctor and the girl walking into the light, while he was dragged down into the dark. The billionaire was gone. The CEO was gone. There was only prisoner A9284CV and the long, silent years waiting for him in the dark. Justice, it turned out, had finally arrived at the gate. This story isn't just a drama, it's a mirror. George Holloway had everything: money, power, status, but he lacked the one thing that truly makes a person valuable: humanity. He judged Imani Brooks by her hoodie and her skin color, never realizing that the trash he was abusing was the only person on that plane capable of saving a life. Karma doesn't always hit instantly, but when it does, it hits with the force of a freight train. In minutes, George lost his freedom, his fortune, and his future, all because he couldn't control his own ego. It's a brutal reminder: be kind to everyone you meet. The quiet girl in the corner might be the surgeon who holds your life in her hands tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to stay humble. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.